The morning sun was just starting to peek through the trees when Officer Blake Rodriguez noticed the black Mercedes speeding down Maple Street. He'd been sitting in his usual spot behind the old oak tree for about 20 minutes, nursing his coffee and watching the early commuters rush to work. Most people drove pretty carefully through this neighborhood, but this one was definitely pushing it. Blake flipped on his lights and pulled out behind the Mercedes. The car slowed down immediately and pulled over to the curb in front of a neat row of suburban houses. He could see the driver checking her mirrors, and she seemed to be moving around inside the car, probably looking for her paperwork. As he walked up to the driver's side window, Blake took in the details. The car was spotless, probably cost more than he made in 2 years. The windows were tinted but not too dark. Everything looked legal from the outside. When the window rolled down, he saw a young black woman in her early 30s. She was wearing a crisp white blouse and had her hair pulled back in a professional bun. Her makeup was perfect, like she was heading to an important meeting. "Good morning, ma'am," Blake said, putting on his standard traffic stop voice. "Do you know why I pulled you over today?" The woman looked up at him with wide eyes. I think I might have been going a little fast. I'm so sorry, officer. I was rushing to get to work." Her voice had a slight tremor to it, and her hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly. Blake noticed she had perfectly manicured nails and was wearing what looked like an expensive watch. Gold bracelet, too. His eyebrows went up slightly. "A little fast is right. I clocked you doing 47 in a 35 zone. That's pretty dangerous in a residential area like this." "You're absolutely right, and I apologize," she said quickly. "I'll be more careful. I was just trying to get to the hospital for an important appointment." "The hospital?" Blake's tone shifted slightly. In his experience, people who claimed they were rushing to hospitals were usually making excuses. "What kind of appointment?" The woman reached slowly toward her purse. "May I get my license and registration?" "Go ahead, but keep your hands where I can see them," Blake said, taking a step back. He watched as she carefully pulled out a leather wallet and opened it. Even her wallet looked expensive. She handed him her license and then reached into the glove compartment for her registration. Blake looked at the license. Dr. Jessica Chen Patterson. The address matched the upscale part of town, about 15 miles from where they were now. "Doctor, huh?" he said, looking from the license back to her face. "What kind of doctor?" "I'm a cardiac surgeon," she replied, her voice steadying a bit. "I got called in for an emergency surgery this morning. That's why I was rushing. I know it's not an excuse, but someone's life is literally on the line." Blake studied her face. She looked sincere, but he'd heard all kinds of stories over the years. People claimed to be doctors, lawyers, teachers, you name it, when they got pulled over. And in his experience, most of the people driving cars this expensive in this neighborhood weren't exactly earning their money the traditional way. "Cardiac surgeon," he repeated slowly. "That's a pretty big job for someone so young." Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I've worked very hard to get where I am, officer. I went to medical school for 4 years, then did a 5-year residency, then a 2-year fellowship. I'm 34 years old." Blake looked at the car again, then back at her jewelry. Something didn't add up in his mind. Sure, doctors made good money, but this level of luxury seemed excessive. The car alone was probably worth more than most people's houses. "This is a pretty expensive car for a doctor just starting out." "I'm not just starting out," Jessica said, a hint of frustration creeping into her voice. "I've been practicing for 5 years now, and this was a gift from my husband when I finished my fellowship." "Must be some husband," Blake said, walking around to look at the back of the car. The license plate was standard, nothing fancy, but there was a small medical symbol sticker in the rear window. "What does he do for work?" Jessica hesitated for a moment. "He works in law enforcement." That got Blake's attention. "Law enforcement? Like what, security guard?" "He's a police officer," she said quietly. Blake came back to the window. "Really? What department?" "The same one you work for, actually," Jessica said, looking down at her hands. Blake felt a little uncomfortable but pressed on. "What's his name? I might know him." Jessica looked like she really didn't want to answer. "James Patterson. He's a detective." Blake searched his memory but couldn't place the name. There were a lot of detectives in the department and he mostly worked patrol. Doesn't ring a bell. What unit? Major crimes, Jessica said softly. Blake nodded, but wasn't entirely convinced. It wouldn't be the first time someone claimed to be married to a cop to get out of a ticket. Well, regardless of who your husband is speeding. And I have to say, this car and all this jewelry, it's raising some questions for me. Jessica's face changed, and Blake could see she was getting upset. Questions about what exactly? Look, lady, I've been doing this job for 8 years. I know what doctors' cars look like, and I know what drug dealers' cars look like. This setup you've got here, it's making me wonder. Are you seriously suggesting that I'm involved in drugs? Jessica's voice was getting louder now. Because I drive a nice car and wear jewelry? Blake put his hand on his radio. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down. Getting hostile isn't going to help your situation. I'm not being hostile, I'm being incredulous, Jessica said, her professional composure starting to crack. I've shown you my medical license, I've told you I'm a surgeon, I've been completely cooperative, and you're treating me like a criminal because I have nice things. Blake studied her face. She seemed genuinely upset, but he'd seen good actors before. Tell you what, why don't you step out of the car for a minute? I want to have a conversation with you. Jessica's eyes went wide. Step out of the car? Why? I was speeding, give me a ticket. I need to get to the hospital. Ma'am, please step out of the car, Blake repeated, his voice taking on a more authoritative tone. Jessica looked around nervously. The street was quiet except for a few joggers in the distance. Officer, I don't understand what's happening here. I was cooperative, I admitted I was speeding. I'm willing to accept the ticket. Why are you escalating this? Blake was starting to get annoyed with her resistance. In his mind, innocent people didn't argue when asked to step out of their vehicle. Because I'm conducting a traffic stop, and I have the right to ask you to exit your vehicle. Now please do so. Jessica took a deep breath and slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. As she opened the door and stepped out, Blake noticed she was wearing a pencil skirt and heels, exactly what you'd expect a professional woman to wear to work. But he also noticed how expensive her outfit looked. The blouse was silk, the skirt was clearly tailored, and those shoes probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Officer Rodriguez, Jessica said, reading his name tag. I really need to get to the hospital. There's a patient waiting for me. Can we please just handle this quickly? Blake looked at her standing there in her perfect outfit with her perfect makeup and her expensive accessories. Everything about her screamed money, but something in his gut told him it wasn't the right kind of money. We'll handle this as quickly as possible, ma'am. But first, I need to ask you a few more questions. Blake walked slowly around Jessica's car, taking his time to examine every detail. He could feel her eyes following him as he moved, and he could tell she was getting more nervous by the minute. Good, he thought. Nervous people usually had something to hide. This is a really nice vehicle, he said, running his hand along the hood. What year is it? It's a 2023, Jessica replied, standing awkwardly by the driver's door in her heels. Officer Rodriguez, I really do need to get to the hospital. My patient is probably already being prepped for surgery. Blake ignored her plea and continued his inspection. 2023 Mercedes S-Class. That's what, about $120,000? Maybe more with all the options. Jessica shifted her weight from one foot to the other. I don't know the exact price. Like I said, it was a gift. Some gift, Blake muttered, peering through the passenger window. The interior was pristine leather, with all the fancy electronic displays. Mind if I take a look inside? Inside? Jessica's voice went up an octave. Why would you need to look inside? I was just speeding. Blake straightened up and looked at her directly. Ma'am, I'm conducting a traffic investigation. I have reasonable suspicion that there might be more going on here than just speeding. Reasonable suspicion of what? Jessica asked, her professional training kicking in. She knew her rights and she wasn't about to let them be trampled on. You pulled me over for speeding. I admitted I was speeding. Write me a ticket so I can get to work. Blake didn't like her tone. In his experience, people who knew too much about their rights usually had reasons to know them. I'm suspicious of how a young woman can afford a car like this, jewelry like that, and clothes that probably cost more than most people make in a month. Jessica stared at him in disbelief. Are you seriously profiling me right now? Because I'm young and black and driving a nice car, you think I'm a criminal? This has nothing to do with race, Blake said quickly, though somewhere in the back of his mind he knew that wasn't entirely true. This has to do with the fact that your story doesn't add up. You claim to be a surgeon, but you look barely old enough to be out of college. I showed you my medical license, Jessica said, her voice rising. It has my photo on it, it has my credentials. What more do you want? Blake had glanced at the license, but he hadn't really studied it carefully. Medical licenses could be faked, couldn't they? Anyone can get a fake ID these days. I've seen some pretty convincing ones. Jessica pulled out her phone. Fine. I'll call the hospital and you can talk to my supervisor. I'll call my husband and you can verify who he is. This is ridiculous. Put the phone away, Blake said sharply. You don't make any calls until I say you can. Jessica looked at him like he'd lost his mind. I have the right to make a phone call. Not during a traffic stop, you don't, Blake said, though he wasn't entirely sure about that. Now I'm going to ask you one more time. Can I search your vehicle? No, you cannot search my vehicle, Jessica said firmly. You have no probable cause. I was speeding. That's a traffic violation, not a felony. You cannot search my car for a speeding ticket. Blake felt his jaw clench. He hated it when people quoted law at him, especially when they were right. But he wasn't ready to give up yet. Ma'am, your nervous behavior and evasive answers are giving me probable cause to believe you might have something illegal in this vehicle. My nervous behavior? Jessica's voice was getting louder now. I'm nervous because you're treating me like a drug dealer instead of a doctor who was rushing to save someone's life. Of course I'm nervous. You're scaring me. A jogger ran past, on the sidewalk, and glanced over at them. Blake noticed and lowered his voice. Ma'am, I need you to calm down. Getting emotional isn't going to help your situation. I am calm, Jessica said, though clearly she wasn't. I'm also confused about why this traffic stop has turned into an interrogation. I've been cooperative. I've answered all your questions. I've shown you my identification. What exactly do you want from me? Blake walked back around to the driver's side of the car and looked inside again. The car was spotless, which in his mind was another red flag. Who kept their car this clean? Unless they were trying to hide something? This car is awfully clean for someone who drives it every day. Jessica threw her hands up in exasperation. I'm sorry, is keeping a clean car now illegal? I had it detailed last weekend because my mother-in-law was visiting. Is that a crime? Blake didn't respond to her question. Instead, he keyed his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 742. I'm going to need a backup unit at my location. Jessica's eyes went wide. Backup? For what? I was speeding 12 miles over the limit. Blake stepped away from her to speak into his radio quietly, but she could still hear him. I've got a suspicious vehicle stop. Young black female, claims to be a doctor, driving an expensive vehicle, wearing expensive jewelry. Her story's not adding up. Jessica felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. She could not believe what she was hearing. Did you just describe me as young black female to dispatch? What does my race have to do with anything? Blake finished his radio call and walked back over to her. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remain calm until my backup arrives. Remain calm? Jessica's voice was shaking now, but not from nervousness. She was angry, really angry. You just profiled me over the radio. You just told dispatch that my race was relevant information for a speeding ticket. I was giving a description, Blake said defensively. That's standard procedure. Standard procedure for what? A bolo? Am I a fugitive now? Jessica was really struggling to keep her composure. Officer Rodriguez, I am a cardiac surgeon at Metropolitan General Hospital. I graduated summa cum laude from Johns Hopkins Medical School. I did my residency at Mass General. I have never been arrested, never been charged with a crime, never even had a speeding ticket before today. And you're treating me like I'm some kind of criminal mastermind because I drive a nice car. Blake could hear the conviction in her voice, and for a moment, he wondered if he might be wrong. But then he looked at that car again, and those diamonds in her ears and that designer handbag sitting on the passenger seat. It all seemed like too much for someone her age, regardless of what she did for work. Look, if you're really a doctor, like you say you are, then you've got nothing to worry about, Blake said, trying to sound reasonable. Once my backup gets here, we'll sort this whole thing out. Jessica looked down the street and could see a police car approaching with its lights on. Her heart sank. This was really happening. A simple speeding ticket had somehow turned into whatever this was, and she had no idea how to make it stop. Officer Rodriguez, she said, trying one more time to reason with him. I know you're just doing your job, but I'm telling you, you're making a mistake. I'm exactly who I say I am. I drive a nice car because my husband and I work hard, and we can afford nice things. I wear nice jewelry because I like jewelry and I can afford to buy it. There's nothing suspicious about any of this except in your mind. Blake watched as his backup pulled up behind his patrol car. 2 officers got out and started walking toward them. He felt more confident now that he had support. We'll see about that, ma'am. We'll see about that. Jessica watched the 2 additional officers approaching and felt a sense of dread wash over her. This was spiraling completely out of control, and she had no idea how to stop it. All she wanted was to get to the hospital and do her job. Instead, she was standing on the side of the road being treated like a criminal, and it was all because she had been running late and driving too fast. She couldn't help but wonder if this would be happening if she looked different, if she drove a different car, if she lived in a different neighborhood. Deep down, she already knew the answer. The 2 backup officers walked up to where Blake and Jessica were standing. The first officer was an older man with gray hair and tired eyes who looked like he'd seen everything the job had to offer. The second was a younger woman, probably in her late 20s, with short blonde hair and a no-nonsense expression. What's the situation, Rodriguez? The older officer asked, looking between Blake and Jessica. Blake straightened up, feeling more confident now that he had support. Traffic stop turned into something bigger, Sergeant Williams. Subject was doing 47 in a 35, claims to be a doctor, but her story's not adding up. Look at this car. Look at her jewelry. Something's not right here. Sergeant Williams glanced at Jessica, who was standing quietly but clearly upset. Her hands were shaking slightly and she kept looking at her watch. Ma'am, what's your name? Dr. Jessica Chen Patterson, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm a cardiac surgeon at Metropolitan General. I was rushing to the hospital for an emergency surgery when Officer Rodriguez pulled me over. The female officer, whose name tag read Officer Martinez, looked at Jessica with what seemed like sympathy. How long have you been standing out here, ma'am? Jessica looked at her watch again. Almost 30 minutes now. My patient was supposed to be in surgery 20 minutes ago. Blake jumped in quickly. She's been evasive and uncooperative. Claims her husband is a cop, but I've never heard of him. Claims to be a doctor, but look at her age and look at this car. It doesn't add up. Sergeant Williams walked around the Mercedes, examining it the same way Blake had. It's definitely an expensive vehicle. What did you say your husband does? He's a detective with this department, Jessica said, her voice getting stronger. Detective James Patterson in major crimes. And I'm not some young kid pretending to be a doctor. I'm 34 years old. I've been practicing medicine for 5 years. Officer Martinez seemed to recognize something in Jessica's tone. Ma'am, do you have any other identification with you? Hospital ID, maybe? Jessica nodded quickly. Yes, it's in my purse in the car. May I get it? Blake stepped forward. Actually, I think we need to do a more thorough search first. I want to make sure there's nothing dangerous in that vehicle. A search? Sergeant Williams looked at Blake with raised eyebrows. What's your probable cause? Blake felt put on the spot. Her nervous behavior, the expensive car, the jewelry, the story, that doesn't add up. She's clearly hiding something. Jessica couldn't believe what she was hearing. Hiding something? I've answered every question you've asked. I've shown you my driver's license, my medical license, my registration, my insurance. What more do you want? I want to know how you really afford all this, Blake said, gesturing at her car and clothes. Because I don't think the doctor's story is true. Officer Martinez looked uncomfortable. Rodriguez, she's shown you her medical license. Why don't you run her name through the system and see if she has any priors? Blake had already thought of that, but he was hoping to find something in the car first. I want to search the vehicle. First, make sure there are no weapons or contraband. You need probable cause for a search, Jessica said firmly. And you don't have any. Actually, Blake said, an idea forming in his mind. I do have probable cause. I believe this vehicle might contain evidence of illegal activity. Sergeant Williams looked skeptical. What kind of illegal activity? Blake knew he was reaching, but he was in too deep to back down now. Money laundering, drug trafficking, I don't know yet. But nobody this young drives a car like this legally. Jessica stared at him in complete disbelief. Money laundering, drug trafficking? Are you out of your mind? I'm a heart surgeon. So you keep saying, Blake replied. But I think we need to verify that claim more thoroughly. Officer Martinez was starting to look really uncomfortable with the direction this was going. Rodriguez, maybe we should just run her name and see what comes up. But Blake was determined to prove he was right. I want to search the vehicle, and I want to do a more thorough search of the subject as well. Jessica's blood ran cold. A more thorough search? What does that mean? Blake looked at her expensive outfit and made a decision that would change everything. I want you to lift up your skirt and show me you're not hiding anything underneath. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just gone off. All three officers went silent. Jessica's mouth fell open in shock. What did you just say? She whispered. Officer Martinez took a step forward. Rodriguez, what are you doing? Blake realized he might have gone too far, but he was committed now. It's a standard search procedure. I need to make sure she's not concealing anything. That is not a standard search procedure, Sergeant Williams said sharply. That's completely inappropriate. Jessica felt like the world was spinning around her. You want me to lift up my skirt? On the side of the road? In front of 3 police officers? Blake's face was red, but he doubled down. Ma'am, if you have nothing to hide, it shouldn't be a problem. Are you insane? Jessica's voice was getting louder. That's harassment, that's assault. You can't ask me to do that. I can if I suspect you're concealing evidence, Blake said. Though he could see that both of his backup officers were looking at him like he'd lost his mind. Officer Martinez stepped closer to Jessica. Ma'am, you don't have to comply with that request. That's not a legal search. But Blake wasn't backing down. She's been evasive this entire time. She's clearly hiding something. I have the right to ensure officer safety. Jessica was shaking, now but not from fear. She was furious. Officer safety? You think I'm hiding a weapon under my skirt? Look at me. I'm wearing a pencil skirt and a silk blouse. Where exactly do you think I'm hiding something? I don't know, but I intend to find out, Blake said. Either you comply with the search or I'll arrest you for obstruction of justice. Jessica looked at Sergeant Williams desperately. Sergeant, please, this is completely inappropriate. I'm a doctor. I'm trying to get to the hospital to save someone's life. I don't deserve to be treated like this. Sergeant Williams was clearly uncomfortable, but he didn't want to undermine another officer in front of a civilian. Ma'am, if you just comply with the search, we can get this resolved quickly. Jessica couldn't believe what was happening. She looked around at the 3 officers, all of them waiting for her to humiliate herself on the side of the road. Cars were driving by, people were walking their dogs, and here she was being asked to expose herself because she had been driving 12 miles over the speed limit. This is wrong, she said, tears starting to form in her eyes. This is so wrong. Blake crossed his arms. Ma'am, I'm going to count to 10. If you don't comply, you're under arrest. Jessica looked at Officer Martinez, who was clearly uncomfortable, but wasn't saying anything. She looked at Sergeant Williams, who was avoiding eye contact. She realized that no one was going to help her. She was completely alone in this situation. Fine, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. But I want you to know that this is the most humiliating thing that has ever happened to me in my entire life. With tears streaming down her face, Jessica slowly reached down and lifted the hem of her skirt slightly, just enough to show that she wasn't hiding anything. The whole thing lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. "There," she said, her voice breaking. "Are you satisfied now?" Blake looked embarrassed but tried to maintain his authority. "Thank you for your cooperation." Jessica let her skirt fall back down and wiped the tears from her face. "My name is Dr. Jessica Chen Patterson," she said clearly, looking directly at Officer Martinez's body camera. "I am a cardiac surgeon at Metropolitan General Hospital. I was pulled over for speeding, and I have just been humiliated and violated by Officer Rodriguez for no reason other than the fact that I drive a nice car and wear nice clothes." The words hung in the air, and for the first time since this whole thing started, Blake began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. Blake stood there looking at Jessica, who was still wiping tears from her face. Something about the way she had said her full name with such clarity and dignity, even in her moment of humiliation, made him pause. He pulled out her driver's license again and looked at it more carefully this time. Dr. Jessica Chen Patterson. He had focused on the doctor part before, thinking it might be fake. But now he was looking at the last name, Patterson. She had mentioned her husband was Detective James Patterson. Blake's stomach started to feel a little uneasy. "Patterson," he said out loud, more to himself than to anyone else. Officer Martinez looked over at him. "What about it?" Blake was trying to remember where he had heard that name before. In a department with over 300 officers, it was hard to keep track of everyone, especially detectives who worked different shifts and different units. But Patterson, that name was familiar somehow. "Rodriguez," Sergeant Williams said. "Maybe we should run her information through the system now. See if her story checks out." Blake nodded and walked back to his patrol car with Jessica's license. His hands were shaking slightly as he typed her name into the computer system. The results came back almost immediately, and Blake felt the blood drain from his face. Dr. Jessica Chen Patterson. No criminal history, clean driving record. Current address matched an upscale neighborhood on the north side of town. But it was the emergency contact information that made Blake's heart stop. James Patterson, Detective Lieutenant, Major Crimes Division, Detective Lieutenant. Not just a detective, a lieutenant. That meant he was high up in the chain of command. That meant he was someone important. Blake's mouth went dry as he stared at the screen. He clicked on another link to access the department directory. There it was. Detective Lieutenant James Patterson, Major Crimes Division, 15 years of service, multiple commendations. Blake scrolled down and saw a list of Patterson's recent cases: high-profile murders, organized crime investigations, drug trafficking rings. This wasn't just any detective, this was one of the department's top investigators. Blake's hands were really shaking now. He looked back at Jessica, who was standing quietly next to her car, still clearly upset but trying to compose herself. Officer Martinez was talking to her in a low voice, probably trying to calm her down. Blake scrolled back up in the system and clicked on Patterson's personnel file. There was a photo of a tall, serious-looking man with dark hair and intense eyes. Below the photo was his contact information, and at the bottom, his family information. Spouse: Dr. Jessica Chen Patterson, cardiac surgeon, Metropolitan General Hospital. Blake felt like he was going to throw up. This wasn't just some woman making up stories to get out of a ticket. This was really Detective Lieutenant Patterson's wife. And Blake had just humiliated her on the side of the road for no good reason. But it got worse. As Blake continued reading, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Under Patterson's emergency contacts was another familiar name. Chief Robert Chen, retired, father-in-law. Blake's eyes widened. Robert Chen, former chief of police. The man who had run the department for 12 years before retiring just 2 years ago. The man who was still a legend in law enforcement circles. The man who had reformed the department's community relations and was respected by everyone who had ever worn a badge. Jessica wasn't just married to a detective lieutenant. She was the daughter of the former chief of police. And Blake had just asked her to lift up her skirt on the side of the road because he thought she was a drug dealer. Blake sat in his car for a moment, trying to process what he had just learned. This was bad. This was really, really bad. He looked at Jessica again, and suddenly everything made sense. The expensive car wasn't suspicious. Her husband was a high-ranking detective and her father was the former chief. They could easily afford nice things. The medical degree wasn't fake. She really was a surgeon. Her nervousness wasn't because she was hiding something illegal. It was because she was being treated like a criminal for no reason. Blake got out of his car and walked slowly back to where the others were standing. Sergeant Williams looked at him expectantly. "Well?" Williams asked. "What did you find?" Blake's voice came out as barely a whisper. "She's telling the truth." "What?" Williams couldn't hear him clearly. Blake cleared his throat. "She's telling the truth. She really is Dr. Jessica Chen Patterson. She really is a cardiac surgeon. And her husband really is Detective Lieutenant James Patterson from Major Crimes." Officer Martinez looked relieved. "See? I told you her story made sense." But Blake wasn't finished. "There's more. Her father is Robert Chen." Sergeant Williams looked confused. "Robert Chen? Why does that name sound familiar?" "Former chief of police," Blake said quietly. "He retired 2 years ago." The color drained from Sergeant Williams's face. "Chief Chen? She's Chief Chen's daughter?" Blake nodded miserably. "And Lieutenant Patterson's wife." Jessica had been listening to this conversation, and she could see the realization dawning on all three officers' faces. "Now do you believe me?" she asked quietly. Blake looked at her, and for the first time he really saw her, not as a suspicious person who might be a criminal, but as the accomplished professional who had been treated terribly for no good reason. She was still upset, but she was holding herself with dignity despite everything that had happened. "Ma'am," Blake started, his voice shaky. I apologize, I made a mistake." Jessica looked at him with eyes that were still red from crying. "A mistake? You think what just happened was a mistake?" Blake didn't know what to say. He had been so sure he was right, so convinced that her story didn't add up, but he had been completely wrong about everything. Officer Martinez stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're very sorry about how this situation developed. You're free to go, of course." Jessica laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Free to go? I've been standing here for almost 45 minutes. My patient is probably wondering where I am. I've been humiliated and violated because Officer Rodriguez decided I looked suspicious driving while black in a nice car." Blake winced at her words because he knew they were true. He had let his biases cloud his judgment, and he had treated her badly because of assumptions he had made based on her race and her age and her possessions. "Dr. Patterson," Sergeant Williams said formally, "on behalf of the department, I want to apologize for this incident. This should never have happened." Jessica looked at all three of them standing there looking uncomfortable and ashamed, and she felt a mix of anger and sadness. "Do you know what the worst part of this is?" she asked. "It's not that you pulled me over for speeding. I was speeding, and I deserved a ticket for that. It's not even that you were suspicious of my car or my clothes. I understand that police officers have to be observant." She paused and looked directly at Blake. "The worst part is that you had already decided I was guilty of something before you even started investigating. You saw a young black woman in an expensive car and you couldn't imagine any legitimate reason why I might have nice things. You assumed I was a criminal, and then you looked for evidence to support that assumption instead of looking for the truth." Blake knew she was right, and he felt ashamed. "Ma'am, Jessica held up her hand to stop him. "I'm not finished. The worst part of all is that you made me lift up my skirt on the side of the road like I was some kind of common criminal. You violated my dignity and my rights because you couldn't accept that a black woman might actually be exactly who she says she is." The three officers stood there in silence, not knowing what to say. Jessica wiped her eyes one more time and walked back toward her car. "Ma'am," Blake called after her. "What? What are you going to do?" Jessica turned back to look at him. "I'm going to go to the hospital and try to save someone's life if it's not too late. And then I'm going to go home and tell my husband and my father exactly what happened here today." Blake felt his career flashing before his eyes. "Please, ma'am, I know I made a mistake, but— Officer Rodriguez, Jessica said calmly, you didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose to see me as a threat instead of a person. You chose to humiliate me instead of treating me with respect. Those weren't mistakes. Those were decisions. She got into her car and started the engine. As she drove away, Blake stood there on the side of the road, finally understanding the full magnitude of what he had done. Jessica arrived at the hospital 30 minutes late for the surgery. Her hands were still shaking as she scrubbed in, and she had to take several deep breaths to center herself before entering the operating room. The patient was stable, but the delay could have been catastrophic. As she worked to repair the damaged heart in front of her, she couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened on the side of the road. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Blake sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. He had written and rewritten his incident report 5 times, but he couldn't find a way to make what he had done sound reasonable. Every version he wrote made him look worse. Sergeant Williams had been unusually quiet during the drive back, and Officer Martinez had barely spoken to him at all. Around noon, Blake's phone rang. The caller ID showed it was his supervisor, Captain Thompson. Rodriguez, I need to see you. In my office. Now. Blake's stomach dropped. He walked slowly down the hallway to the captain's office, feeling like he was walking to his own execution. When he knocked on the door, he heard a gruff, "Come in." Captain Thompson was sitting behind, his desk with a grim expression. On his desk was a tablet showing what appeared to be a social media video. "Sit down, Rodriguez." Blake sat down and immediately recognized the scene on the tablet. It was body camera footage from Officer Martinez's camera showing the entire traffic stop from beginning to end. The video had been posted on social media with the caption, "Racist cop humiliates doctor for driving while black." This video has been viewed over 50,000 times in the last 2 hours, Captain Thompson said quietly. The phone hasn't stopped ringing. The mayor's office called. The chief called. Internal Affairs is already opening an investigation. Blake felt like he was going to be sick. "Sir, I can explain—" "Explain what?" Captain Thompson's voice was getting louder. "Explain how you turned a simple speeding ticket into a civil rights violation? Explain how you asked a respected surgeon to lift up her skirt on the side of the road? Explain how you profiled the daughter of our former chief?" Blake had never seen Captain Thompson this angry. "Sir, I thought she was acting suspicious." "The car, the jewelry, her age?" "Her age?" Captain Thompson stood up. "Rodriguez, Dr. Chen Patterson is 34 years old. She's been a surgeon for 5 years. She graduated from one of the best medical schools in the country. What exactly was suspicious about her age?" Blake realized there was no good answer to that question. "I just thought—" "You thought what? That a young black woman couldn't possibly afford nice things through legitimate means? That's what you thought, isn't it?" Blake couldn't deny it because it was exactly what he had thought. "I made an error in judgment, sir." Captain Thompson sat back down and rubbed his temples. "An error in judgment. That's what you're calling this." He turned the tablet around so Blake could see the comments under the video. There were hundreds of them, and they were not kind to either Blake or the police department in general. "This isn't just about you anymore, Rodriguez," Captain Thompson said. "This is about the reputation of this entire department. Do you know how hard we've worked to build trust with the community? Do you know how many years it took to repair the damage from incidents like this?" Blake was starting to understand the full scope of what he had done. This wasn't just going to affect his career. This was going to affect everyone he worked with. 3 hours later, Detective Lieutenant James Patterson walked into the police station. Blake had never met him before, but he recognized him immediately from the photo in the personnel file. Patterson was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that commanded respect. He walked straight to Captain Thompson's office, without saying a word to anyone. Blake couldn't hear what was being said behind the closed door, but he could see through the glass that Patterson was speaking in a calm, controlled voice. That somehow made it worse than if he had been yelling. After 20 minutes, Patterson left the captain's office and walked over to Blake's desk. Blake stood up quickly, not sure what to expect. "Officer Rodriguez," Patterson said quietly. "I understand you had an interaction with my wife this morning. Blake's voice came out as a whisper. "Yes, sir. Detective Lieutenant Patterson, I want to apologize." Patterson held up his hand. "Let me tell you about my wife, Officer Rodriguez. Jessica graduated at the top of her medical school class. She completed one of the most competitive surgical residencies in the country. She worked 16-hour days saving people's lives. Last month, she performed emergency surgery on a 6-year-old boy and saved his life. The month before that, she worked 36 hours straight during a multi-car accident to make sure everyone who came into her OR went home to their families." Blake stood there listening, feeling smaller with every word. "She drives a nice car because we can afford a nice car," Patterson continued. "She wears nice jewelry because she likes jewelry, and she's earned the right to wear it. She dresses professionally because she's a professional, and you treated her like a criminal because you couldn't imagine that a young black woman might have achieved success through hard work and dedication." Blake didn't know what to say. "Sir, I'm not finished," Patterson said, his voice still calm but with an edge to it. "Do you know what my wife was doing when you pulled her over? She was rushing to the hospital to perform emergency surgery on a 52-year-old father of 3 who was having a massive heart attack. Because of your little fishing expedition, that surgery was delayed by 30 minutes. 30 minutes that could have been the difference between that man living or dying." Blake felt like he was going to collapse. Is the patient okay?" "He's alive," Patterson said. "No thanks to you. My wife is a professional, and she did her job despite the trauma you put her through. But that man came very close to dying because you decided to play detective instead of writing a speeding ticket." Blake was staring at the floor now, unable to meet Patterson's eyes. "Detective Lieutenant, I am so sorry. I know I made a terrible mistake." "A mistake," Patterson repeated. "You know what a mistake is, Rodriguez? A mistake is adding numbers wrong on a report. A mistake is forgetting to turn in your paperwork on time. What you did wasn't a mistake. What you did was a choice to see my wife as less than human because of the color of her skin." Patterson leaned closer. "And now you're going to live with the consequences of that choice." Over the next week, the video of Jessica's traffic stop continued to spread across social media. News outlets picked up the story. Civil rights organizations got involved. The police department's phones rang constantly with complaints and demands for action. Blake was suspended pending the outcome of the internal affairs investigation. The department's reputation took a serious hit, and several community outreach programs that had taken years to build were suddenly in jeopardy. Jessica, meanwhile, decided to use her experience to make a difference. She gave interviews to local news stations, speaking calmly and professionally about what had happened and what needed to change. She didn't call for Blake to be fired or arrested. Instead, she talked about the need for better training, better oversight, and better accountability. "This isn't about revenge," she said in one interview. "This is about making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to other people. Police officers have a difficult job, and most of them do it well. But when officers make decisions based on prejudice instead of facts, people get hurt." Her father, former Chief Chen, also spoke publicly about the incident. "My daughter was treated in a way that no citizen should ever be treated by law enforcement," he said. "But more importantly, she was treated in a way that no human being should ever be treated by another human being." A month later, Blake was fired from the police department. The internal affairs investigation found that he had violated multiple department policies and had engaged in discriminatory behavior. He also faced a civil lawsuit from Jessica, which was eventually settled out of court. The department implemented new training programs focused on bias recognition and de-escalation. Officers were required to attend monthly workshops on community relations and cultural sensitivity. Body cameras became mandatory for all traffic stops, and new procedures were put in place for supervisory review of any stop that lasted longer than 15 minutes. Jessica continued her work as a surgeon and became an advocate for police reform. She spoke at police academies and community forums, sharing her story and working to build bridges between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Blake found work as a security guard at a shopping mall, but the incident followed him wherever he went. He eventually moved to a different state, trying to start over. But he never forgot the lesson he learned that day on Maple Street, that when you treat people as less than human, you become less human yourself. The story became a case study in police academies across the country, a reminder of how quickly a routine traffic stop can go wrong when officers let their biases override their training and their humanity. And Jessica's grace and dignity in the face of injustice became an inspiration to people who had faced similar treatment, showing them that they didn't have to suffer in silence. In the end, what started as a simple speeding ticket became a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is not anger,